Hey guys, how's it going? So today we're going to talk about how to create some low relief textures. So textures that do not have a lot of pattern to them. So things that are more solid and hard like metal and glass. So things that you're going to need are erasers. I have a gummy eraser and I also have a plastic eraser. I like to have both just because it gives you some options. But if you only have one, that's completely fine. You're going to need your practice drawing sheet. Now you can look at this directly off of your computer, or I would recommend printing it out just so that you can compare your drawing to the picture side by side. And then you're going to need your drawing pencils. So I've got a range, let me zoom out a little bit here. I've got a range of pencil weights that I'm working with today. Your graphite pencils are your Bs, 2Bs, 4Bs, and then your H pencils as well. So I'm going to go ahead and grab an HB. An HB pencil is the same as a number 2 pencil. Okay, just so you are aware. I'm also going to grab, a 2H. I'm going to grab a B. I'm going to grab a 2B and a 4B. That's not a 4B. Double check to make sure that the pencils that you think you're grabbing are the ones that you're actually grabbing. And if you have one, it might be helpful. You might not have one, which is okay, but it might be helpful to have a 6B pencil. That's going to give you really, really dark areas to work with. So I'm just making sure I've got everything that I need. I need a 2H. Okay. So I've got 5 different pencil weights. That's all you're really going to need, but if you have more, they can be useful. So zooming in here a little bit, just to recap what we've talked about earlier in the year, but it's good to review it again together. So your HB pencil, like I said, is basically like your regular number 2 pencil. The higher the B, the darker the graphite or the pencil is going to be. And it also feels softer. And you can test this out as well. This is my 6B pencil that I'm working with right here. It goes on a lot smoother and it's very dark. Now compare that to, let's do a 2B. It's good to practice, what different amounts of pressure does to the way the pencil looks when you press. Now, one big piece of advice that I have for you is to never press too hard, no matter what weight of pencil you're using. I basically use the same amount of pressure over the whole thing, and it's only until the very end of my drawing that I actually start to press a little bit harder. So this is my HB. And the reason why you don't want to press too hard is because it can make it hard to get off if you make a mistake. And here's my 2H. I'm using the same amount of pressure for all of these pencils, but you can just see how the H is a lot harder, so you're not going to get as much of a deposit of graphite. So let's go ahead and get started here. So I would highly recommend starting by just very, very lightly drawing the contours of your object. So remember that the contours are not just the outer edge, it's not just the outline, it's actually all of these little details that you've got going on in here. Now, I would recommend using, for sketching the contours, your 2H pencil. And again, you don't want to press too hard. Now, the reason why I like to use the 2H is because it's a lot lighter, so it's easier to take off of the paper. And that way, when you're ready to clean things up, it'll come right off for you. So what I'm doing here, think back to when we learned how to do our Zentangle animals, and I told you guys to, draw what you see. Think about where these pieces of your object are interacting with each other. Where do you see this corner crossing over, this big round shape that we've got right here? How big is the base of this bowl compared to the bottom part right here, or this top part right here? Think about that, okay? And then what I like to do is I like to sort of mark off where things go. So just looking at this picture, this is why it's helpful to have it printed out right next to you. Just looking at this picture, I see that the edge of the bowl comes to about right here. I'm just going to very, very lightly mark it off. The other edge is going to be over here. This is a very symmetrical shape, so we want to make sure that it's even on both sides. Now remember, as another tip, your hand likes to do this motion. It likes to do that, so don't force it to do other weird things that it's not quite used to doing. You can turn your paper, do what works for you, as long as you check to make sure that your proportions are looking good as you go. It's all about practicing. So I feel like the edge of the bowl stops about here. The other bottom edge is about there. And again, it's nice to draw very lightly with a 2H pencil because you can easily erase and move things around. Remember, it's important to establish correct proportions before going in with value and details. I think that's about where the base of the bowl is. And then I'm going to come in here. I'm going to let my hand do the motion that it likes to do here. And I'm kind of looking, how far down does this go from the bottom of the page? I'm going to say it's about right there. And it's okay if your sketch is a little bit messy. As long as it's light, you can always clean it up. It's better to have it be messy in the beginning so that you can establish things where they need to go. And then you can always clean things up later. Just making some little adjustments to my shape. Okay, so I feel pretty good about that shape. Little tiny tweaks could be made here and there. I think it's pretty good for right now. Okay, so that's the start to my contours, and then I'm going to just keep going. So I got to get this little lip of the bowl right here. And I'm constantly looking back and forth at the photo and my drawing, playing spot the difference. What little adjustments can be made? It's so important not to press too hard here. We want to try to get away from heavy outlining. Because when you're creating something that looks 3D, we don't see outlines in real life. So we want to do our best to hide them as much as possible. Now notice that this lip of this bowl is a lot thicker than over here because this is closer to us. So we're seeing more of this lip than back here. It's a little bit thinner. So I'm just going to do my best to imitate that. And then for the base of my bowl, I'm noticing that these little edges where they meet the lip of the bowl, they come a little bit more inside than where these outer corners right here. They're a little bit more in. So instead of having the base of the bowl start around here, I'm going to go here. Just look for little guides in the subject to help you find a roadmap for all of your marks. Okay. All right, and then I'm going to just get one last little thing, and that's this ring on the inside. Okay, so we've got some very basic contours. It's not super perfect, but it'll do for right now. Okay, so there's some things that we need to think about with metal. Okay, so we have these bright highlights that we're seeing here, the brightest areas. Those are the parts that are not going to get any graphite at all. Then we have midtones. Those are all of the sort of grayish areas, and then the core shadows are the darkest areas. But you have a lot of different midtones. There's a really, really big range of midtones here, and you only have a few really, really dark areas. So this is what I like to do. This is a tip that I would give you. So what I like to do is I like to sort of mark off where the highlights are with very, very loose pencil lines. So I'm going to start with this big highlight right here. This needs to be super light because highlights don't have outlines around them, and that'll take away a lot of the realism if you put outlines around your highlights. So I'm going to just very lightly draw in where some of those highlights are, and I'm going to do these two on the side. And this is not the only way to create highlights. We're going to do something with our eraser later to make these highlights stand out even stronger. This is just sort of a roadmap to help us figure out where I need to add my pencil and where I can avoid putting pencil. Now what's nice about pencil is that you can always erase things. It's okay if you accidentally mess something up here or there. That's part of the process. Okay, so I've got 3 general highlight areas. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to jump into my dark shadows right away. What I'm actually going to do first is I'm going to continue to take my 2H pencil, and I am going to do a very, very light layer of graphite over the whole thing except where I have those highlights. Now I'm following with the contours of the object. I don't want to just go straight across and up and down in random directions. I want to make sure that these shadows, these values, flow with the contour. And you can even see some of these lines in the actual stainless steel that you're looking at here. There's a few little lines for where the steel was polished. You can recreate that. Even though this texture isn't very high relief, there's not a lot of bumps or things sticking out of it, it's still a texture nonetheless. Look for those small areas that you can use to create realism. I'm being very, very light with my pencil. I'm just barely grazing the paper. I like to say whispered lines. We're just whispering some pencil onto the paper. So you've got a layer of graphite there, and I'm just going to continue that process. I'm going to come in here. I'm avoiding my highlight areas. It's okay if a little bit of pencil comes into the highlight area, just a little bit. The difference between metal and glass is that the highlights that are on glass are very chunky. They're very defined shapes, whereas highlights on metal tend to blend into the shadowy areas a little bit more. They still stand out pretty strong, but they do blend a little bit. There's a bit more of a gradient. So it's okay if these marks that you're making here sort of carve into the highlight just a little bit on the edges, okay? So just continue this process, and this is not supposed to be a very quick thing. It's called slow shading for a reason. You're taking your time, making your marks dense, but not pressing too hard. Just a very light layer. And I'm still following with the contours of the object. You can turn the paper if you need to so that your hand finds a more natural way to move the pencil. The more you practice with this, the faster you're going to get at it. But it's okay if you're taking your time right now, you're just learning. Okay, we're almost done. I just got to do the ridge here, the lip of the bowl. And I think I've got just about everything but those highlights with a layer of graphite. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we want to do, now that we've got a layer of shadow, is we want to go up a level in pencil. So we were just using a 2H. I'm going to put that to the side for right now. And I'm actually going to go ahead into the HB. I'm going to skip the regular H because I don't really think we need to use that right now. So using an HB, like I said, this is just a regular number 2 pencil. So you're probably used to the kinds of marks that this makes. This is the moment where we're going to start to develop a few darker midtones. So right now we have this very, very light layer of gray. Okay, this light gray is probably about the same as this light gray on the lip of the bowl. Okay, so anything that's this tone, this value, we're not going to go any darker. But there are a lot of areas that are darker. For example, the sides of the bowl over here get a little bit darker. Under here it's darker. So look closely for those areas. You know, look at your photo or your subject, whatever you're looking at, and start to build things just a little bit darker. Again, we're not pressing hard. The pencil is already darker enough. We don't need to press any harder than we were with our 2H pencil. Your pencil graphite will do the work for you. And again, it's just a slow, easy process. Just gently grazing the paper. And if you work slowly and carefully, the pencil will have a naturally blended appearance. When you take art classes, your teachers are going to try to get you away from blending with your finger. And there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't blend with your finger. One is that it leaves oils on the paper and it can be hard to erase. The paper will also yellow over time from the oils. But also it's just a traditional practice in fine art to not smudge the pencil around. See what you can do. Oops, that scared me. See what you can do with just your medium here. So I've got it a little bit darker there. And I'm going to keep going, looking for other darker areas. So these areas in here are a little bit darker. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more graphite. We're going to be doing this process a lot as we build up these layers of value. There's a wide range of values here. It's not just light gray, dark gray, black, white. There's a whole spectrum that we want to recreate. Okay, these areas get a little bit darker. I'm not completely covering up all of the values that I have here just yet. I'm creating a gradient, slowly moving from those highlights to darker shadows. And these skills that you're developing right now help you a lot with just general observations in your everyday life, looking closely at small differences you notice. Helps you think critically about what you're seeing. You might think that, I'm not really an artist, I'm never going to use this again. It does stay in your brain, it carries over, it helps you with your hand-eye coordination, and also just your observational skills. And then lastly, I'm going to build up a little bit over here. Still flowing with the contours, conforming to the form of my subject. I'm noticing that these shadows right here, there's a pretty distinct line, a distinct edge between the highlight and the shadow. Notice that it's not as distinct in these areas. That's a good observation to make, so you can probably push this value up a little bit closer to that highlight. Look for those small little nuances. And again, don't rush, or else it might not be smooth and metallic. Okay, so we just used our HB pencil. Let's go ahead and use our 2B. We can skip the B. So now we've got some nice lighter midtones and some nice midtones. Now we can start to build up some darker midtones. So look again for where things get a little bit darker. Notice the edges down here. Those get a little bit darker. One more so than the other edge. Using the same pressure. The pencil is already darker, so you don't need to press harder. Just look for where you see value changes and include them in your drawing. You might have missed something the first time around. It's okay to go back with your other pencils and just add things if you need to. It's a little bit even darker in here, but not by much, just a few touches here and there. I'm noticing this dark line that sort of swoops through there. And you might have noticed that there's this highlight on the bottom of the bowl. We'll go back and add that with our eraser later. You can always add highlights. It's a little dark up here. Okay, I think things are really coming along here. Just keep on building. Noticing that this kind of lighter area sort of dips in a little bit right here. I want to try to include that. I'm drawing what I see, looking for those small moments. Okay, come down here. I'm also noticing this kind of darker rim over here on the bottom of the bowl, so I'm going to go ahead and include that as well. Just darken up that area. Okay. And then last step, I'm going to go ahead into my darker B. So whatever next step of a B you have, it might be 6B. I'm going to actually sharpen this really quick. Okay, and now we can go in here and do these really, really rich dark shadows. But again, we're not pressing any harder than we have been. Looking for those nice, crisp dark shadows. Now this is the part where if you feel confident about, how your values are looking, where they are, how your proportions look, now you can start to press a little bit harder if you're really trying to build up some rich dark areas. And that's what you want. You want a nice full range of values. So it's okay if you start to push a little tiny bit harder. Not by much, just a little bit. But that is one of your last steps in creating a full value drawing. And again, we're creating a gradient here. We're not trying to cover up all the shadows we already have. This is just enhancing them. Still moving with the contours. Maybe put a few little darker areas in here. Okay. So I feel pretty good about what we've got here. But there's one more step that we need to do, and that is cleaning this up. So this is the part where you can go in with your eraser. Now your gummy eraser is nice because you can squish it into all sorts of different shapes to get to those hard to reach areas. So there's still a few little outlines from where I traced my highlights. I'm going to go in there and just gently, gently tap, just to lift those off a little tiny bit. And your eraser, you can also tap a little bit into your shadows to blend. Because remember, metal, the highlights sort of blend into the shadows just a little bit. The highlights are still nice and bright, but there's a little bit more of a softer transition from the shadows to the highlights. This is also the time where you can go in there and find more highlights that you may have missed before. So I'm noticing that there's sort of this really, really skinny highlight that kind of comes around right here. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to get my eraser, or you can use a sharp corner of your plastic eraser and just sort of come back in there and define. We want our edges to be nice and solid. That's what's going to really help this look like metal, is to clean up the edges. We don't want anything to look fuzzy. When I come in here, I'm going to define this highlight that we see sort of around the base of the bowl. And your gummy eraser is fantastic for this part. I want to get all that little tiny little bits of reflected light to come through. Now you may see areas where you're thinking, I should have put more value there. That's okay. You can always go back and add more. Creating value and texture is a push and pull. Add things, take things away. You can do it as much as you need to until you are satisfied with your end result. So I just want a little bit more value on this highlight. Okay. Can look for other little areas of highlight. And once you're happy with how your highlights look, your last important step is to go around the very edges of your subject and erase any messy lines, any messy outlines, because that will not help your metal to look like metal. It'll look fuzzy. We want to think about that edge quality. What are the qualities of the edges? Are they soft and fluffy, or are they hard like metal? Okay, so that's your metal bowl. Let's move on to glass. Now I think we can do this one a little bit quicker than we did the metal, because a lot of the ideas are the same. You know, sketching out the contours, laying out where the highlights are, and then building from very, very light midtones up to the darker values. Now, there's one thing I want to tell you, and that is that you don't always have to trace the highlights right away. You could, in theory, just wait until the very end and go back in there with your eraser and pull out the highlights. So I'm going to do that with you guys. Now I am going to get the background, because when you're drawing glass, you can almost always see through the glass into what's on the other side. Notice that the table is a little bit distorted here. So I'm going to include that. So I'm coming in with my 2H pencil, and I'm going to just draw, kind of marking off here where the upper corners of the glass are, and the glass tapers down. It gets a little bit skinnier as it goes down. So we need to consider that as we are doing our contour sketch here. I know it may be tricky to draw straight lines, but practice it. See what your hand likes to do to be able to draw a line straight. My hand, personally, I like to just do this, and I'm actually sort of pulling my arm a little bit with my hand. I usually can't just draw a straight line in one go. I kind of have to do it in little pieces. But again, that's okay, because you're going to clean things up. Now notice that the base is not just flat, it's rounded down here, and we want to include that as well. Round out that base. And then the top is just ever so slightly rounded as well. We can't really see the completely flat top-down view, or rather straight across view of the glass. So just round that out a little tiny bit. Okay, and we can see a little bit of the other side of the opening of the glass there. Okay, and then we've got to get the water. That's a rounded shape as well, a very skinny oval. Okay, and now let's get this table back in here, just the very edges, so that we can activate the negative space. So our glass is not just floating, and we'll get the distorted view of the table. Whatever you see, just draw it. You know, it's confusing to think about, why does the table look like that through the glass? It's okay, just draw what you see. Now we've got to get this little base of the glass down here. There's a lot of shapes happening in here, and we're going to tackle those when we start to build up our values. But right now, just worry about those obvious contour lines that you're seeing. Okay. Take a sip of my coffee there. All right. So like I said, this time around I'm going to show you how you can just wait till the end to do your highlights. So we've got our contour lines here, and I'm actually going to change this top edge. I'm not super happy with it. It's a little too round. Make that a little bit thinner. There we go. Okay. I'm going to actually darken these up ever so slightly just so that we don't lose them. Alright, so now same process as when we did the metal. Go ahead and do a very, very light layer of a light gray mid-tone over the whole thing. Now remember, we gotta still go with the contours of the object. I'm gonna actually fold my paper so I don't smudge my bowl drawing that I made. When you're working on an actual artwork, remember to never fold it. That's just me doing that for right now. So see, I'm flowing with the roundness of the glass. The glass is not this flat thing. We want to conform to the shape, or to the form rather. Conform to the form. And we're doing this fairly slowly. I'm doing it kind of quickly just because I'm a little bit more experienced with this, but take your time doing this. That's what's going to make your values look nice and have that blended effect without actually smudging it. Now you might think, well, the glass is clear. It's not actually gray, so why are we adding gray? Well, the only areas that should be white are those highlights, and we're going to go back and add them later. Those are the lightest part of your subject. Everything else is not as light as white, so that's why we're doing a very, very light gray over everything. Come back this way. Okay, so we've got a light layer there, and I'm going to just actually add a little bit of a mid-tone to the background, just a bit. I don't want to lose my glass here, so I'm not going to go super heavy. Just add a little tiny touch. It's important to think about how your subject here, the glass, interacts with the environment around it, how the environment warps through the glass, how things change. Okay, so that was our 2H. Let's go in with our HB. So now we can start to darken some things up. So let's say that this light gray that we have over everything right now, that's like about as light as this in the center here. So whatever is not as light as that, you can add a little bit more pencil. So the water for sure is a lot darker. You've got that wavy line of the table back there. Now, there's some very light areas in here. I don't want to lose those, so I'm actually going to just very, very lightly kind of draw shapes. Like I see all these interesting shapes in the base of the glass where the glass is sort of warping. So I'm going to do my best to not mess up those lighter gray areas. Just sort of observing what I see and adding shadows where I see them in the picture. Okay. It's a little tiny bit darker up here. And then notice these really dark areas on the sides of the glass. That's where the glass, we're not looking straight through it. The glass sort of piles up there and it looks a little bit darker because we can't see through it completely. It's not as clear as, let's say, if you're looking directly through the glass. So you can start to darken some of those up a little bit too. Kind of build yourself a map for where things are going to get darker. Now, like I mentioned earlier, one of the big differences between drawing metal and drawing glass is that the highlights and shadows on glass seem very chunky. You know, there are some soft gradients, like up in here, it's a little bit softer of a gradient between this gray and this gray, so I'm being very careful. However, you have these big chunky shadows down here. You have a big chunky shadow right across here. So we're going to go to that in just a moment. First, I'm going to just darken up the table a little bit. Make it about the same tone as the table that we see through the glass. Okay. Now let's go in with our 2B. And we can start to darken some things up. So again, just like with the metal, wherever you see shadows that are darker, go ahead and darken them. Just think about where the shadows are more solid or more chunky. Right here, where the water is in the cup, that is a nice dark shadow. That line around the water. It's darker here closer to us than it is in the back over there. You've got this shadow up here, a little bit over here. I'm not making anything up here, I'm just looking and imitating. Where do you see things happening? Now, I'm somebody who kind of works on a few different areas at a time. You might be somebody who prefers to finish one area before moving on to a different one. That might just be your artistic style, and that's fine. Although I will say that I find that working on multiple areas at a time will sort of save me from getting too attached to one thing too fast. I might realize, like, oh, that's not quite what it was supposed to look like, and then you have to go back and change things. So I find that just working incrementally in small areas and then moving on to other areas here and there kind of keeps your eyes fresh. You won't be staring at the same thing for too long. Start to build some of these shadows up here. Now, this isn't super photorealistic to what we're looking at on the table here in this photograph, but we're doing our best. The more you practice with it, the better it's going to be. Okay, I'll darken up my table. I'm noticing a few little cast shadows from the glass on the table, so I'm just going to do my best to include those. Okay, now we can have fun and go into our 6B pencil and really start to pull out some of these rich, dark shadows. Make them nice and solid, because that's how they look in the glass. Those really, really dark areas are usually these nice, crisp shapes. Okay, now we haven't forgotten that we've got to add some highlights in here. So I'm going to take my gummy eraser again, and I'm just looking for those highlights, and I'm going to try to imitate the shapes that I'm seeing. So there's a nice bright highlight right here, and you know what, I think my glass, I think up here it actually needs to be a little bit darker to help that highlight stand out. If your highlights don't stand out, that probably means that you need a darker gray mid-tone up here. So I'm just going to darken this all up just a little bit. It's not going to mess up any of the other shadows I have. I'm going to actually use my H. I think I just need a little more power here. There we go. And it's okay if you got to do this. This happens to me all the time where I don't quite make my gray midtones as dark as they need to, and then my highlights don't really stand out. And that's the big thing with glass, is that those highlights need to be bright and chunky compared to the non-highlighted parts. Okay, now we can come in here and very, very carefully, don't do this too quickly, start to define. Try to imitate those shapes that you're seeing. And it's okay if you go a little bit too far and maybe need to reapply some shadow. Look for all those small little highlight areas. I'm going to get this one right here. It comes across. Look for where they are placed. That's really important too. Where do you see them? What are they doing? What shapes are they? Come in here. The thing about your gummy eraser is sometimes, you know, when you make it into a point, that point wiggles around and it doesn't hold its shape. That's why having one of these guys can be helpful as well. If your eraser has a nice point like that, it can help you out because it's a nice solid eraser. The downside to a non-gummy eraser is that it leaves little eraser boogers all over your paper. And then you have to either blow them off or very, very carefully dust them off, because if you rub with your hand too hard, it's going to smear your graphite. And that's not what we want. Some of your highlights may be more defined than others. Some of your highlights may be very, very subtle. So look for those small differences. That's going to make all the difference in your drawing. Okay, And then I'm noticing a few little highlights on the table back here. Those are fun. I'm going to include those. Okay, so that was metal and glass. And like I said, the more you practice, the stronger you're going to get. So if you don't get things perfectly right away, it's okay. Just keep trying. So that's all for today, guys, and I will see you next time. Bye!